Hey everyone, today we're looking at 3.1, measuring economic activity and illustrating its variations, but today really just focusing on measuring the economic activity. This section is a bit of an introduction to macroeconomics. Some of the stuff here is a foundation for the rest of the course, really. Some of the terms we learn here we'll be using in most lessons from here on in. What we're going to do, we're going to learn what gross domestic product is, plus how it's calculated. So I hope no one's afraid of a little maths, but the maths is super basic. We are going to learn what gross national income is, and again, how to calculate it. Then we'll look at real gross domestic product and real gross national income. Now, these terms are going to look pretty odd to you right now, but they will make sense later on. We'll also calculate these. These calcs, they're a little bit trickier, a little bit less intuitive, but they're still well within your capabilities. No one will struggle with the maths side of it. Okay, and then in class later this week, we're going to look at what we can actually do with these measures. So what do they represent? Why do we care? Let's start with gross domestic product. Here's our definition. It's the dollar value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in 1 year. All right, get that definition down. It's an important one. So all the goods and services produced and sold, it represents the economic activity in a country. We'll now break it down into its components. So this equation right here is absolutely crucial. The sooner you commit it to memory, the better you'll be able to understand the course. Gross domestic product equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Now, the first one, C, stands for consumption spending. Consumption spending is all household purchases of final goods and services in a year. Pretty straightforward. So this can be represented by a picture of me going on a shopping trip. There we go. Investment, the next one, is the spending by firms on capital. Examples could be mining firms building their infrastructure, so all those rail lines that they use to take the coal out to the ports to export it, or it could be a commercial business perhaps refitting their office space, so that's all spending on capital. But essentially what you want to think of is really spending by firms. That's really what we want to look at there. The G is for government spending. This is when the government purchases goods and services. For example, schools and the police. That's government spending. Now, I want to note here a common misconception. So a lot of people think that transfer payments are part of government spending. Now, a transfer payment is when the government just gives money to people. So think of unemployment benefits or the old age pension, just giving money. So while the government is spending money, it doesn't technically count as government expenditure because they're not spending it on goods and services. So for that reason, it also doesn't count as gross domestic product because there's nothing produced. Net exports are the total value of exports minus the total value of imports. Just to clarify the terminology here, exports are goods and services produced in a country and then sold overseas. So like what Australia does with coal. And imports are what we buy in from other countries. So we import iPhones into Australia. Imports. Okay, these are the four components of gross domestic product: consumers, firms, government, and foreigners. Now they actually represent everyone who can spend on goods and services. There's no other group. So if we count the spending on these four components, we have a gross domestic product. Finally, we're going to clarify what's not included in GDP, because a lot of people think these things are, but they are not. So firstly, our definition included the term final goods. That means a complete good. So let's say a car manufacturer, they buy in rear view mirrors in order to complete their car. This is what we would call an intermediate good. It's not a final good, it's a good used to complete another good. So if we count the mirror that they buy in GDP, and then we count the car in GDP, then we're essentially counting the mirror twice, which isn't really accurate. Therefore, we only include final goods. We also don't include non-production transactions because we're only interested in the production of goods and services. So if you buy a share in a company or a crypto coin, there is no good or service produced. So financial transactions, they don't count. Same if you buy a used car off of Gumtree. That production counted when it was first produced, but not when it's resold. That would be counting it twice. We also only count what can be counted. So people doing illegal activities like selling crack on the streets, they're not going to report why they are selling goods. They're not reporting that to the government, so it's not going to be counted in our GDP, right? Also crack related, a plumber doing a cash job. So this is where you pay them in cash and then they don't report it to the government, so they don't have to pay tax on what they earn. So again, the government doesn't know about it, so it's not going to be counted in our GDP. As far as the government's concerned, there was no good or service produced. All right, we'll go into, finally, the transfer payments. Just a reminder about those. They do not count. So when people get money given to them from Centrelink, does not count as good or service because nothing is produced. Now, calculating GDP. This should be relatively straightforward. Here we've got some economic data from the fictional country of Burmistan. Now, given what you've seen previously in this video, I want you to calculate the GDP of Burmistan. So pause now and do this. Okay, hopefully you got $18.4 billion. So the key here is knowing the equation of GDP and not getting put off by the distractors that will often be in the questions. They're not just going to give you 4 or 5 numbers to add up, right? They're not going to make it that simple. They're going to put in other things like savings or tax revenue to throw you off. Not to throw you off, but to ensure that they want to know that you actually understand. So that's why they're going to be there. So we just have to add up C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Okay, and as we can see down here, equals $18.4 billion. Okay, next we're going to look at gross national income. Now this is gross domestic product plus net income from abroad. So it's clear that the difference here is this net income from abroad. What does this mean? This is income that flows between countries. So using examples will help here. So here we've got the example of Lesotho. This is a small country in Africa that is actually completely contained within another country, South Africa. For this reason, many Lesotho workers, they go off and they work in South African mines and then they send their income home to Lesotho. This adds to the gross national income of Lesotho and it would be subtracted from the gross national income of South Africa. Another aspect of this net income is profit repatriation. So we'll look at Equatorial Guinea. When oil reserves were found off the coast of Equatorial Guinea, multinational oil companies, they came in to extract it and sell it. So while all of the oil exports of Equatorial Guinea count towards their GDP because it's produced in the country, the profits will actually flow out of the country to wherever the shareholders are located. So it might be in the US or Europe. So that will detract from their gross national income. One way of considering gross national income is that it's the total income of a country's factors of production, regardless of where those assets are physically located. Now, we'll go over this again in class because people find that a little bit confusing. One way of calculating GNI is pretty much the same. So I want you to have a go at this. So pause now, have a go, and then we'll go through it. Okay, so hopefully we got 18.2 billion. So all we're doing is we are GDP, C plus I plus G plus X minus M, plus net income. So income received from abroad, that's a positive for GNI, income sent abroad, so those profits going overseas or the remittances going overseas, that's going to be subtracted off. So the net income is negative 0.2 billion. So that's why we get our GNI that's just a little less than our GDP. Okay. Now, real GDP. So GDP is the total value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders. Measuring in 1 year is straightforward, but we want to make comparisons of how much we produce year to year. This is difficult because prices change year to year, generally upwards. For that reason, to get a better number, we hold prices constant to get real GDP, a useful number for making year to year comparisons. Let's look at an example. So in 2008, the entire economy of Burmastan was 10 motorbikes sold at 15,000 each, 10 cars at 20,000 each. So we can see that the nominal GDP is $350,000. Okay. In 2009, prices have increased. So we're selling 10 motorbikes at 16,000, 10 cars at 21,000 each. So GDP here is 370,000. Now this number suggests that the economy has grown, but the level of production is exactly the same, 10 motorbikes, 10 cars. So there hasn't actually been any growth, the stuff has just gotten more expensive. What we can do to get the real story here is we look at real GDP. So we use 2008 prices. So if we put those 2008 prices in, we can see that real GDP is $350,000 and the economy hasn't actually grown at all. Now, the way we calculate real GDP using a GDP deflator. The GDP deflator is a price index that shows the increase in prices as compared to a base year. It deflates the level of nominal GDP. By knowing nominal GDP and the deflator, how much prices have gone up, we can determine real GDP. Here we have a set of nominal GDP data and the GDP deflators. 2008, where the GDP deflator is 100, is the base year. So we're going to compare other years to 2008 prices. So real GDP for 2008 it's going to be that $212.5 billion because the base year prices haven't changed. Let's look at 2009. All we have to do is plug in the numbers to this equation. Nominal GDP is 220.4 and GDP deflator is 103.2. So that means that prices have increased 3.2% since the base year of 2008. Now doing the calculation, real GDP comes out to be $213.57 billion. Okay, just putting in the numbers here. So I want you to pause and work out the values for 2010 and 2011. Okay, so we should have got these numbers here. If you didn't, check back through your working to see what happened. Now, students can be a bit confused by the deflator, so I'll try to illustrate it here by looking at GDP figures for 2011. Here we see the nominal GDP, $236.4 billion. This isn't real GDP, this is GDP that's been inflated by inflation. After using the GDP deflator, we find that the real GDP is actually only equal to $218.48 billion. The inflated GDP figure has now been deflated to a number that can be useful for year-to-year comparisons. Now, calculating real GNI uses the exact same process, so we'll be able to transfer that across. That's easy. All right, I think that's enough new information to take in one video. This has actually been a long one. We'll consolidate all this in class.